Footsteps echoed down the polished titanium corridors of Sector 4. They thought she was just a fragile exchange student from a muddy little rock called Earth. They thought cornering her after an astrophysics lecture would be easy. 50 seconds later, 6 elite mercenaries realized they had cornered an apex predator. Doctor. Peterson was droning on about orbital supply chain logistics, his voice a rhythmic, monotonous hum that perfectly matched the gentle vibration of the space station's atmospheric scrubbers. The classroom was a sterile amphitheater of white plasteel and holographic displays suspended high above the swirling gas clouds of Jupiter. For most of the students at the St. Jude Galactic Conservatory, this was a Tuesday afternoon like any other. For Abigail Miller, it was the calm before a storm her biology had been anticipating for the last 20 minutes. Abigail sat in the third row, her digital stylus hovering over a datapad. To anyone else in the room, she looked like a quintessential 19-year-old exchange student. She was petite, wearing an oversized university sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. But beneath that unassuming exterior was a physiology forged in the crucible of a Class 9 Deathworld. Earth was a planet characterized by crushing gravity, volatile weather, and an evolutionary history built entirely on the concept of apex predation. Her father, Wilson Miller, was the CEO of Miller Holdings, a massive terraforming conglomerate that had recently partnered with Lockheed Martin Orbital to secure the highly contested Novaterra mining contract. It was a multi-trillion-dollar deal that had unseated the Brighton Consortium, a ruthless syndicate known for hostile takeovers that usually involved literal casualties. Abigail had been warned to stay on Earth, surrounded by private security. But she was stubborn, and Wilson was proud. They both believed the conservatory, a neutral zone in deep space, was safe. They were wrong. 10 minutes before the lecture was scheduled to end, Abigail's body began to betray the illusion of safety. It started with her amygdala, the primitive lizard brain center of her human neurology that specialized in keeping her ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats prowled the tall grass. Something in the hallway was wrong. It was subtle. The acoustic dampeners in the classroom walls were designed to filter out exterior noise, but they couldn't filter out a sudden lack of it. The automated janitorial drone that passed by the door every Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m. hadn't passed. The faint, rhythmic tapping of students walking to their next seminars was completely absent. And most telling of all, the sliver of bright LED light filtering under the heavy acoustic classroom door was continuously interrupted by a large, stationary shadow. Someone was standing right outside. Several someones. "Hey, Abby," whispered Samantha, a station-born girl sitting to her left. Samantha was tall, slender, and possessed the fragile bone density of someone who had never experienced a full 1G of gravity. "Did you get the formula for the thruster degradation? I missed it." "Yeah," Abigail replied softly, sliding her datapad over. Her voice was perfectly steady, but internally her endocrine system was undergoing a violent transformation. Her resting heart rate, usually a calm 60 beats per minute, began a steady, controlled climb to 110. Her adrenal glands flooded her bloodstream with epinephrine and cortisol. The pupils of her eyes dilated slightly, pulling in more light, sharpening her peripheral vision to a razor's edge. Blood flow was systematically restricted from her digestive tract, and extremities pooling instead in her major muscle groups. This was the human fight-or-flight response. To the rest of the galaxy, it was a biological anomaly. Most species, upon sensing extreme danger, froze or experienced catastrophic systemic shock. Humans, however, essentially injected themselves with a cocktail of combat stimulants. Abigail didn't look toward the door again. She kept her eyes on Dr. Peterson, but her mind was calculating. She mentally inventoried her backpack, a heavy, tungsten-lined thermos, full of hot coffee, 3 solid-state memory drives, a reinforced datapad, and a heavy-duty climbing carabiner. She remembered the training sessions back on Earth with her uncle Captain Reynolds, a former Special Operations operative. When you're cornered, Abby, you don't wait for them to dictate the terms. You change the math. Violence of action. You hit first, you hit fast, and you don't stop until the threat is neutralized. The lecture hall clock ticked down. 2 minutes left. Abigail quietly zipped up her backpack, ensuring the heavy thermos was positioned right at the top opening. She stood up, sliding past Samantha. "Excuse me?" she murmured. "Bathroom," Samantha whispered. Abigail just nodded. She walked down the tiered steps toward the front of the classroom. Every step felt impossibly light. The gravity on the station was set to a comfortable 0.8 G to accommodate the diverse student body. To Abigail, who grew up walking in a full 1.0 G, it felt like she was moving on a trampoline. Her muscles, dense and tightly coiled, were overcompensated for this environment. She pushed the heavy acoustic door open and stepped out into the hallway, letting it swing shut and click on its heavy magnetic lock behind her. The trap was sprung. The hallway was wide, pristine, and lined with recessed plasteel lockers on one side and massive reinforced observation windows on the other. Beyond the glass, the swirling, violent storms of Jupiter provided a terrifyingly beautiful backdrop. Waiting for her were 4 men. They weren't students. They were large, broad-shouldered, and moved with the stiff, calculated rigidity of heavily augmented tactical operatives. They wore nondescript grey maintenance uniforms, but the bulky outlines beneath their jackets betrayed concealed weaponry. The leader, a man with a jagged scar running along his jawline and cold cybernetic ocular implants, stepped forward. His name was Dominic. Flanking him were Victor and Gregory, both towering walls of muscle, and lingering a few paces back was Leo, a wiry man holding a neural stunner with a suppressed kinetic barrel attached. They had meticulously planned this. Sector 4 had been digitally isolated. The cameras were looping false footage. The security drones had been rerouted. All they had to do was grab the girl, inject her with a powerful sedative, and walk her out to a maintenance airlock, where a stealth shuttle was waiting. It was a textbook extraction. Abigail Miller. Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that echoed in the empty corridor. He didn't draw a weapon, aiming to keep this quiet. "Your father has a very important board meeting in 3 hours. You're going to help us renegotiate his position. Come quietly, and you won't get hurt." Abigail stood motionless, her backpack clutched in her right hand by the top strap. She looked at Dominic, then at Victor, then at Gregory. Her brain processed their stances. They were confident, overconfident. They saw a small, unarmed girl. They didn't see the kinetic energy waiting to be unleashed. "I'm not going anywhere," Abigail said, her voice dropping an octave devoid of the panic they expected. Dominic sighed a sound of mild annoyance. He nodded to Victor. "Put her to sleep." Victor stepped forward, reaching into his jacket to pull out a pneumatic sedative injector. He reached out with his left hand to grab Abigail's shoulder. He never made contact. Abigail didn't step back. She stepped in. Utilizing the lower gravity, she launched herself forward with explosive speed that defied her small frame. She swung her heavy backpack in a brutal, tight arc. The tungsten-lined thermos inside acted as a bludgeon. The bag collided with Victor's face with a sickening wet crunch. The dense impact shattered his nose and fractured his orbital bone. Victor's head snapped back, his equilibrium instantly destroyed, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet, with its strings cut blood instantly pooling on the pristine white tiles. For a fraction of a second, total silence descended on the hallway. Gregory and Dominic froze their brains, struggling to process the sheer velocity and violence of what had just happened. This was a soft target. She wasn't supposed to fight back, let alone neutralize a 200-pound augmented mercenary in a single devastating strike. That microsecond of hesitation was all Abigail needed. Gregory reached for the stun baton on his belt, stepping over his writhing partner. Abigail dropped her backpack and lunged. She grabbed Gregory's wrist with both hands just as he unclipped the baton. Earth-evolved bone density met station-born joint weakness. Abigail twisted her entire torso, applying a savage amount of torque. A loud snap echoed through the corridor as Gregory's wrist broke. He opened his mouth to scream, but Abigail had already stepped inside his guard. She drove the heel of her boot directly into his kneecap. The joint inverted with a loud pop. As Gregory buckled forward, howling in agony, Abigail ripped the activated stun baton from his limp hand and jammed it directly up under his jaw, driving thousands of volts into his central nervous system. Gregory convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back in his head, and dropped like a stone. 2 down. 4 seconds had passed. "Take her down! Lethal force authorized!" Dominic roared, stumbling backward as he reached beneath his jacket, drawing a heavy kinetic pistol. Leo, standing further back, leveled his weapon at Abigail's chest. The human fight-or-flight system is not just about strength. It is about rapid, terrifyingly quick, spatial problem-solving under extreme duress. Abigail saw the barrel rising. She knew she couldn't outrun a bullet, even with enhanced reflexes. Instead of retreating, she dove to the floor, grabbing Gregory's unconscious heavy body by the collar and hoisting his torso up as a meat shield. Thwack thwack. 2 suppressed kinetic rounds slammed into Gregory's tactical vest, the heavy impact vibrating through Abigail's arms. She pushed the heavy body forward toward Dominic, throwing off his line of sight, and scrambled toward the wall. Her eyes locked onto a red emergency wall bracket. A heavy industrial fire extinguisher sat in the cradle. The safety text warned that it required a 300-pound pressure release to remove a failsafe to prevent accidental dislodging in zero-gravity environments. Fueled by a massive surge of hysterical strength, a uniquely human trait where the brain bypasses the body's natural limits to preserve life, Abigail grabbed the handle. She braced her foot against the bulkhead and yanked. The heavy plasteel retaining clips snapped like cheap plastic. Abigail spun around, hauling the massive 40-pound cylinder over her head. Leo was stepping around Gregory's body, aiming his pistol. Abigail hurled the heavy extinguisher across the 5-yard distance. It flew through the air like a guided missile, smashing directly into Leo's chest. The sheer kinetic force threw him backward off his feet, his ribs cracking audibly before his head slammed against a row of metal lockers. He slid to the floor, motionless. Dominic was the last one standing in the immediate vicinity. He stared at the carnage around him. His elite squad veterans of corporate espionage and black ops wet work had been systematically dismantled in less than 20 seconds by a college sophomore. He raised his pistol, his hands shaking slightly, the red laser sight dancing wildly across Abigail's sweatshirt. Abigail stood up slowly. Her chest was heaving, her knuckles were white, and her eyes were dark, dilated pools of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She didn't look like a student anymore. She looked like a predator that had just been backed into a corner, only to discover it liked the taste of the fight. "Target is hostile!" Dominic practically screamed into his wristcom, backing away, slowly toward the intersection. "I repeat, Aegis actual target is hostile. She's a Class 9 Deathworlder. Send the reserve team to Sector 4 now." Abigail didn't wait for him to finish. She bent down, picked up Leo's dropped kinetic pistol, checked the weight of the magazine with a practiced flick of her wrist, and racked the slide. The heavy metallic clack echoed down the long, empty hallway. She looked at Dominic, tilted her head slightly, and began to walk toward him. Dominic watched the girl advance through his remaining cybernetic optic, his mind violently rejecting the reality unfolding before him. She wasn't running. She wasn't seeking cover. Abigail Miller was walking down the center of the corridor, her posture relaxed, but coiled, the stolen kinetic pistol gripped loosely but securely in her right hand. He raised his own weapon, his hand trembling as his combat stimulants fought a losing battle against sheer biological terror. He pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. Humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage was never claws, venom, or armor. It was pattern recognition. As a pursuit predator on the plains of ancient Earth, early humans had to calculate the trajectory of a fleeing gazelle, the wind speed and the arc of a thrown spear, all in a fraction of a second. Abigail's brain, flooded with norepinephrine, perceived Dominic's micro-movements, the slight dip of his right shoulder, the tensing of his jaw, the subtle shift in his stance, before his finger even completed its physical compression on the trigger mechanism. She didn't try to dodge the bullets. She simply wasn't where he aimed. Abigail sidestepped with a fluid, terrifying grace. The heavy suppressed rounds shattered the reinforced plasteel observation glass behind her, venting a momentary hiss of atmosphere before the station's automated bulkheads slammed down to seal the breach. Before Dominic could adjust his aim, Abigail brought her weapon up. She didn't use the laser sight. She pointed the barrel using proprioception, the innate human awareness of where one's body parts are in space, and squeezed the trigger twice. The heavy pistol bucked a weapon designed for heavily augmented synthetics with hydraulic dampeners. For a station-born civilian, the recoil would have shattered their wrist. For Abigail, her dense, earth-gravity-forged ulna and radius absorbed the shockwave effortlessly. The first round took Dominic in the right shoulder, spinning him violently. The second round slammed directly into the center mass of his tactical vest. The kinetic shielding absorbed the penetration, but the sheer blunt force trauma cracked his sternum and collapsed his right lung. He hit the floor hard, gasping for oxygen that his body could no longer process his weapon, skittering uselessly across the polished tiles. Abigail didn't spare him a second glance. She stepped over his wheezing form, popping the magazine on her pistol to check the remaining ammunition. 5 rounds. Not enough. Suddenly Dominic's dropped wristcom crackled to life, the audio amplified in the dead silence of the hallway. Aegis Actual to Strike Team 1. Do you have the package we are deploying Team 2 to your sector via the hydroponics maintenance shafts? Acknowledged, Dominic. Abigail picked up the comm unit. She didn't speak. She just crushed the delicate electronics beneath the heel of her boot, severing the connection. She had perhaps 90 seconds before Team 2 arrived. She needed a tactical advantage, a terrain that suited a biological organism over heavily augmented technology-reliant mercenaries. She sprinted down the corridor, taking a sharp left toward the Sector 4 botanical atrium. The atrium was a massive multi-level greenhouse used by the conservatory's xenobotany department. It was a sprawling jungle of broad-leafed flora from Kepler 186, F-hanging vines from Proxima Centauri, and towering, heavy-barked trees designed to filter the station's carbon dioxide. The air here was thick, humid, and warm. Abigail vaulted over the access turnstile and vanished into the dense undergrowth just as the heavy blast doors at the far end of the corridor hissed open. Commander Bradley, a towering wall of cybernetics and composite armor, stepped into the hallway. Behind him filed 6 more mercenaries, their weapons drawn, their tactical visors glowing ominously in the dim light. They worked for the Brighton Consortium, a shadow corporation that had hired out Northrop Grumman exo-logistics security personnel under the table. They were professionals. But as Bradley looked at the devastated bodies of Dominic's elite squad, a cold knot formed in his synthetic stomach. "Spread out!" Bradley ordered, his voice digitized through his helmet mask, thermal optics on. She's a biological target. Find her heat signature." The 6 men fanned out, moving silently toward the entrance of the atrium. They activated their thermal scanners, painting the world in shades of cold blue and vibrant orange. Inside the greenhouse, Abigail was shedding her heavy university sweatshirt. She wore a simple grey tank top underneath. She was already sweating. To most galactic species, excessive perspiration was a sign of systemic failure or illness. For humans, it was the ultimate thermal regulation system. It allowed them to engage in continuous, high-intensity kinetic output without suffering the fatal overheating that plagued almost every other apex predator in the galaxy. She climbed. Her muscles, accustomed to hauling her body weight against the crushing pull of Earth, found the 0.8 G gravity of the station utterly laughable. She scaled the thick, grooved bark of a massive Keplerian iron tree, ascending 40 feet into the dense canopy in a matter of seconds. Below her, Bradley's team entered the atrium. Their thermal optics were instantly blinded by the ambient heat of the greenhouse and the massive biological heat signatures of the exotic flora. "Optics are useless in here," one of the mercenaries, a man named Carter, whispered over the internal comms. "Too much background radiation from the UV lamps." "Switch to motion tracking," Bradley snapped. High above them, Abigail found what she was looking for. A heavy industrial-grade titanium pruning shear, left behind by one of the conservatory's robotic gardeners. It was 3 feet long and weighed roughly 15 pounds. To a human, it was a perfectly balanced javelin. Humans are the only species in the known universe that evolved the biomechanics to throw objects with high velocity and pinpoint accuracy. The complex synchronization of the hips, torso, shoulder, and wrist creates a kinetic whip effect that defies biological logic. Abigail gripped the heavy titanium shear. She locked her eyes on Carter, who was slowly sweeping his kinetic rifle directly beneath her branch. She didn't hesitate. Abigail rotated her hips, snapped her torso forward, and launched the heavy titanium blade downward with bone-crushing velocity. The shear descended like a silent missile. It bypassed Carter's kinetic shielding, which was calibrated to stop high-velocity, low-mass bullets, not low-velocity, high-mass physical objects, and drove itself directly through his right shoulder pad, pinning him to the metal grate of the atrium floor. Carter screamed a horrible, ragged sound that shattered the silence of the greenhouse. "Contact above us!" Bradley roared, pointing his rifle into the canopy and firing blindly. But Abigail was already gone, swinging silently through the vines to another vantage point. She was no longer a student caught in an ambush. She was the ghost of 1,000,000 ancient hunters awakened in the deep dark of space, turning a multi-million-dollar corporate kill squad into her prey. Light years away on the rain-slicked surface of Earth, the neon lights of Geneva bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Brighton Consortium's executive boardroom. Calvin Pierce, the CEO of Brighton, sat at the head of a massive obsidian table. Around him, 6 other executives watched the holographic display hovering in the center of the room. It was supposed to be a live feed of their greatest corporate victory. They had tapped into the optical implants of Bradley's strike team, expecting to see the terrified, sedated daughter of their biggest rival dragged onto an extraction shuttle. Instead, they were watching a horror film from the perspective of the victims. Sitting at the opposite end of the table, flanked by 2 imposing corporate attorneys, was Wilson Miller. The CEO of Miller Holdings sat with his hands neatly folded, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea resting on the saucer before him. He was completely relaxed. "What is happening?" "Calvin," Wilson asked, his voice smooth-laced with a terrifyingly calm amusement. "Your feed seems to be experiencing some technical difficulties." On the hologram, the feed from one of the mercenaries abruptly cut out in a flurry of motion and a sickening crunch of bone. Panic was setting in among the surviving members of Team 2. "Shut it down," Calvin hissed to his communications officer, his face pale sweat beading on his forehead. "Cut the feed." "I wouldn't do that," Wilson said softly. He took a sip of his tea. By corporate law, engaging in an unsanctioned hostile act against a rival CEO's family member is grounds for immediate unilateral asset forfeiture. I need this recorded. For the lawyers, you understand. "She's a child," Calvin shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the hologram, where Bradley was currently firing wildly into the shadows of the greenhouse. "What kind of monster are you? You knew we were sending a team. You used your own daughter as bait." Wilson set his teacup down. The mask of the polite businessman vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had conquered the toughest markets on the harshest planet in the galaxy. "Calvin, you are a product of orbital privilege," Wilson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. "You look at my daughter, and you see a small, fragile girl from a mudball planet. You don't understand Earth. We don't survive by hiding behind kinetic shields or hiring thugs in grey suits. We survive because we are the apex." Wilson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the obsidian table. "I didn't use her as bait. I simply sent her to school. You chose to corner a tiger in a cage. Now you get to watch her eat." Back on the St. Jude Galactic Conservatory, the atrium was a war zone of shattered flora and groaning men. Only Bradley and one other mercenary remained. They were backed against the heavy reinforced glass of the greenhouse wall, their weapons tracking frantically across the dense foliage. "Come out!" Bradley screamed, his digital voice cracking with genuine biological fear. "We have orbital support. You can't win." Abigail dropped from the canopy directly behind them. She landed in a perfect crouch, the impact absorbed flawlessly by her knees. Before the second mercenary could turn, she lunged, sweeping his legs out from under him with a vicious roundhouse kick. As he fell, she snatched his kinetic rifle from his grip, spun the weapon around, and drove the heavy composite stock directly into Bradley's helmeted face. The kinetic dampeners in Bradley's armor tried to compensate, but the sheer physics of the strike overloaded his neck servos. He staggered backward, his vision swimming his weapon, dropping to his side. The second mercenary, scrambling on the floor, managed to pull a backup sidearm and fired wildly. A kinetic round grazed Abigail's left bicep. The fabric of her tank top tore, and a sharp, burning agony flared across her arm. For an alien species, this sudden spike in localized pain would trigger a paralyzing systemic shock, dropping their blood pressure to fatal levels. For Abigail, the pain was merely a switch. Her brain instantly released a massive flood of endorphins, a natural opiate thousands of times stronger than morphine. The pain vanished, replaced by a cold, searing focus. She didn't flinch. She stepped over the mercenary on the floor, aimed the stolen rifle down, and crushed his weapon hand beneath her boot. She turned her attention back to Bradley, who was struggling to pull a combat knife from his chest rig. Abigail dropped the rifle. She stepped inside. His guard grabbed the thick armor plating on his shoulders and headbutted him directly on the bridge of his tactical visor. The plasteel visor shattered. Bradley collapsed backward, completely incapacitated. The atrium fell silent, save for the hum of the atmospheric scrubbers and the groans of the defeated men. Abigail stood breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling in deep, measured rhythm. Her grey tank top was ruined. Her knuckles were bruised, and a shallow crimson line ran down her left arm. She walked over to Bradley, reached down and unclipped the long-range transmitter from his belt. She tapped the communication button, knowing exactly who was listening on the other end. "Mr. Pierce," Abigail said, her voice steady cold and echoing slightly in the vast, empty greenhouse. "This is Abigail Miller. I just wanted to inform you that your renegotiation has failed. Cancel your remaining contracts, or I will drop out of my orbital logistics class and come to Geneva to finish this in person." She crushed the transmitter in her hand and tossed the pieces onto Bradley's chest. 10 minutes later, Dr. Peterson and the campus security force cautiously unsealed the acoustic doors of Sector 4. They found Abigail sitting quietly on a bench outside her classroom, her backpack resting on her lap. She was drinking the remaining lukewarm coffee from her slightly dented thermos. Samantha, the fragile station-born student, peeked out from behind the professor, her eyes wide as she took in the devastation lining the hallway. She looked at Abigail, her jaw trembling. "Abby, what are you?" Samantha whispered. Abigail offered a small, polite smile, the terrifying predator slipping back beneath the skin of the quiet exchange student. "I'm just a girl from Earth, Sam. Did you end up getting that formula down? Did you enjoy this sci-fi HFY story about an underestimated Earthling turning the tables on galactic mercenaries? If you want more thrilling tales of humanity, proving we are the ultimate apex predators of the cosmos, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment.